Undercover CEO exposes ruthless supervisor. What happens next will shock you. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. Ethan Carter's heart pounded as he stood by the back entrance of his own department store, wearing a simple uniform and holding a bucket of cleaning supplies. He had worked hard to build his business from the ground up, but over the past few months, he'd been hearing rumors, dark, unsettling whispers, about a supervisor named Greg who ran this branch like a personal fiefdom. Although Ethan prided himself on staying connected with employees at all levels, something about the swirling tales of mistreatment felt too serious to ignore. And now, armed with nothing but a few rags and a resolve to see for himself, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than ever. He needed to know the truth. The moment he stepped inside, it was clear the atmosphere was tense. A young employee hurried by, eyes downcast, as if afraid to make eye contact with anyone, and that sense of fear draped the entire store. The usual cheerful hum of commerce was replaced with hushed conversations that died away whenever Greg walked past. In less than a minute, Ethan saw a striking scene, Greg barking orders at an employee named Mia, demanding she hand over her till. When Mia hesitated, she'd literally just finished a transaction, he snapped at her so loudly that customers paused in their browsing to stare. That single outburst felt like a thunderclap in the store's stale air. Ethan's instincts flared. This was more than just a strict manager. Something was deeply wrong, and he intended to uncover every detail. Mia, startled, rushed to comply, her hands trembling as she removed the money tray and surrendered it to Greg. No pleasantries or words of thanks came from the supervisor. Instead, he shoved the tray at a second worker, barking, "Count it out now, and if it's short, you're both staying late." The second worker, who looked equally terrified, scrambled to the nearest service counter to count under Greg's watchful glare. Meanwhile, Ethan quietly observed from a corner, gripping his mop's handle tightly. He could feel his jaw clench, but he knew he had to remain calm, remain the unnoticed janitor, at least for now. Greg turned away, grumbling about inefficiency and wasted time, leaving Mia near tears. Ethan knew that anger alone wouldn't fix anything. He had to see this place from the inside, day by day, to truly understand the scope of the problem. Yet that first confrontation, loud, intimidating, and public, told Ethan that the rumors hadn't been exaggerations. Something about Greg's demeanor suggested he felt untouchable, like he believed no one would ever question him or hold him accountable. And Ethan knew he would have to proceed cautiously if he wanted to catch him in the act. That was the key, capturing hard evidence, witnessing the abuses firsthand. He vowed then and there not to let his employees suffer this way. Ethan moved deeper into the store, carefully studying how employees interacted with customers and, more importantly, how they interacted with one another. He overheard small snippets of conversation, someone fretting about missing overtime pay, another complaining that their days off kept getting revoked with little notice. Every time Greg passed, the group hush fell like a suffocating blanket. It was unmistakable, fear ruled here. Ethan mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and did the menial tasks his disguise called for, but his mind was always alert. He noticed the surreptitious glances from a few employees who appeared curious about the new janitor, but they were clearly too afraid or preoccupied to say much. At one point, he crossed paths with Greg in a narrow aisle. Their eyes met momentarily, but Greg seemed to dismiss him as yet another lowly worker. That dismissiveness was exactly what Ethan wanted. The less suspicious Greg was, the more truth Ethan could gather. He forced himself to maintain a passive expression, nodding respectfully as Greg marched off toward the customer service counter to berate yet another staff member. Ethan had planned this infiltration meticulously, securing permission from a handful of trusted upper-level managers who understood the seriousness of the complaints. Only those he absolutely trusted knew about his disguise. If Greg got wind of who the janitor really was, it would ruin everything, and employees might never speak freely again. So Ethan wiped surfaces, restocked toilet paper in the restroom, and made a careful mental list of every sign of trouble. It didn't take long to confirm that Greg had created an oppressive environment. Employees were paranoid and exhausted, jumping at the slightest reprimand, no matter how ridiculous. And though Ethan's desire to confront Greg right then and there was growing by the minute, he knew he needed undeniable, rock-solid proof of wrongdoing that went beyond general rudeness or an abrasive management style. He needed evidence of real violations, whether it was wage theft, discrimination, or bullying that went beyond the bounds of workplace decency. The next step was to gather that evidence, and that meant staying vigilant, asking the right questions, and ensuring employees felt safe talking to him. He finished his shift that day feeling both outraged and resolute, a combination that sharpened his focus. The sun had set by the time he left the store, but even stepping into the cool night air did little to calm his racing thoughts. He replayed every incident he'd witnessed: Greg's confrontation with Mia, the hushed complaints among the staff, the palpable dread that hung in every corner of the store. Ethan realized the task ahead wouldn't be easy. Confronting a supervisor like Greg, who thrived on fear, required strategy. A single misstep might tip him off, allowing him to retaliate further against employees or cover his tracks. But Ethan also knew time was of the essence. Every day he delayed meant more suffering for the staff who had put their faith in the company Ethan founded. Determined to return in disguise the next morning, Ethan headed home, mentally preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. He wanted Greg to show his true colors in all their ugly detail, and he intended to be there when it happened, ready to expose him for the tyrant he truly was. The following morning, Ethan arrived before most of the employees, wearing the same unassuming uniform and carrying his mop and bucket. He could feel an undercurrent of anxiety drifting through the store even in those early hours, as though everyone was bracing themselves for some inevitable conflict. Greg hadn't arrived yet, and a few staff members murmured quietly among themselves. Ethan saw Mia again, looking pale but forcing a polite smile when she noticed him. There was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, as though she sensed something about this newcomer was different, but she didn't yet know what it was. Ethan busied himself restocking the cleaning supply closet, but he kept an eye on the front doors, waiting for Greg to walk in. In that moment, Ethan thought about the irony of the situation. He was the owner of this entire operation, yet he felt like an undercover detective, lying in wait for the prime suspect. When Greg finally arrived, his presence was like a cold gust of wind blowing through the store. People who had been chatting softly immediately straightened up. The tension rose so sharply that Ethan could almost feel it pressing against his skin. Greg marched toward the manager's office without acknowledging a single greeting from his subordinates. Once inside, he began calling various employees over the intercom. One by one, they made their way to him, looking anxious, re-emerging with the same tense expressions. By the time Mia was summoned, Ethan had discreetly positioned himself near a row of shelves just outside the office, pretending to wipe dust off an already spotless surface. Greg left the door ajar, perhaps an oversight or perhaps a display of arrogance that he had nothing to hide. Regardless, it gave Ethan the chance to hear more than just the tail end of a conversation. He caught the sharp tone in Greg's voice. "I don't care about your personal problems, Mia. If you can't stay late, find another job. And don't expect to get paid for that extra hour we gave you last week. That was a trial run. You didn't perform up to my standards." Ethan's stomach turned. So the rumors were true about unpaid hours and intimidation tactics. Mia's voice trembled as she tried to plead her case. "Sir, I have classes in the evening, and you said that I could leave on time tonight." Greg cut her off. "That was before I saw how slow you were yesterday. You'll stay as long as I tell you to stay. Got it?" His tone carried an unmistakable threat. Ethan could sense Mia's frustration and fear, and hearing Greg's dismissive arrogance firsthand only hardened Ethan's resolve. He gripped the cloth in his hands so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He knew he was here to gather evidence, but every fiber of his being wanted to storm in and reveal who he truly was. He wanted to tell Greg his reign of terror was over, right then. But the time wasn't right. He didn't have enough proof, and employees might be too frightened to speak out publicly without a clear sign of change. So Ethan swallowed his anger, quietly observing, determined to unmask Greg's tyranny for everyone to see. The store was busier now, filled with customers browsing aisles and seeking assistance. Ethan went about his duties, picking up discarded receipts, sweeping the floors, and discreetly watching how Greg interacted with other members of the staff. It wasn't just Mia who got the brunt of his abuse. Greg seemed to target anyone who looked vulnerable. A shy stockroom clerk named Amanda was chewed out in front of coworkers for taking too long to unpack a shipment, even though no one had bothered to help her. Another worker, Ted, got yelled at for requesting a lunch break a mere 5 minutes late. Greg's barrage of complaints seemed endless. No matter how hard these employees worked, it was never enough. He found fault in every small detail, often contradicting himself, as though his real goal was to keep everyone too intimidated to push back. Ethan was doing everything in his power to remain inconspicuous, but his anger simmered just below the surface. He knew he needed to keep calm and methodical, quietly collecting these moments. He had to be strategic in how he confronted the problem. He did manage to exchange a few hushed words with an older employee named Luis. While grabbing a new mop head from the stockroom, Ethan found Luis rearranging shelves, clearly weary from a lifetime of such work. The older man cast a furtive glance around to ensure Greg wasn't nearby before speaking. "I don't know who you really are," Luis said in a low voice, "but I can tell you're not just a janitor. Be careful around Greg. He's got connections, at least he says he does. Anyone who challenges him ends up working the worst shifts or getting fired for some made-up reason." Ethan listened intently, moved by the genuine concern in Luis's voice. But he couldn't reveal his identity yet, so he merely nodded. "I appreciate the warning," he whispered. "I'll keep my head down." Luis sighed, patting Ethan's shoulder before returning to his task. The exchange left Ethan both touched and enraged. Good people like Luis were trapped under the thumb of a bully. The injustice of it all fueled Ethan's determination to bring Greg down. By noon, Ethan felt overwhelmed by the number of small infractions and outright bullying he had witnessed. He knew he needed to document it, somehow get proof that would be undeniable to anyone reviewing the situation later. He thought about discreetly using his phone to record, but Greg kept employees' personal phones restricted on the floor under threat of immediate termination. Sneaking a video would be risky. Still, he tucked his phone in his back pocket, ready to hit record if an opportunity arose. The chance came when Greg started dressing down a timid cashier named Corey, who apparently had made a small mistake processing a refund. Greg's voice rose to a shout, accusing Corey of trying to steal. Corey was on the verge of tears, stammering apologies, clearly terrified that he might lose the only job he had. People in the nearby aisles froze, watching in awkward silence. Even customers appeared stunned by the aggression. That's when Ethan stealthily pressed the record button. With the phone partially hidden inside his mop bucket, the device's camera pointed just enough in Greg's direction to capture his tirade. It was risky, but as Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, he knew he had to take that chance. Greg's rant was long and cruel, belittling Corey not just for the mistake but targeting his appearance, and even his intelligence. "Are you really so stupid you can't count?" Greg sneered. "Maybe I should just dock your pay until you learn to do basic math." That final comment made Ethan's blood boil. This was beyond mere dissatisfaction with job performance. It was humiliating, malicious bullying. Corey stood there trembling, tears welling up, and Greg looked triumphant. The supervisor basked in his power, as though crushing someone's spirit was a casual pastime. Customers were turning their heads in concern, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Ethan recorded the entire exchange, silently praying that it would serve as irrefutable evidence. By the time Greg finally stopped his rant, he stomped off, leaving Corey shaking. Ethan pretended to continue cleaning, waiting until Greg was out of sight to approach Corey. "You okay?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Corey wiped his eyes, nodding in that miserable, defeated way of someone who had no other choice. Ethan gently patted him on the back. It was a small gesture, but hopefully it provided some comfort. And inside, Ethan promised himself that Corey, Mia, Luis, and every other employee forced to endure Greg's cruelty would soon see justice. That evening, Ethan left the store with solid evidence on his phone. He had a plan forming in his mind. He would gather enough instances, video clips, testimonies from employees, until he had an airtight case. Then, when the moment was right, he would reveal who he was and confront Greg publicly. Greg needed to be held accountable, not just for the employees' sake but for the reputation of the company as a whole. Ethan felt morally obligated to ensure no one else suffered in silence. Yet, as confident as he was in his mission, he also felt the weight of responsibility. If he didn't do this carefully, Greg might retaliate harder before Ethan could stop him. That night, Ethan barely slept. He replayed Greg's vicious words in his mind, each toxic statement fueling a slow-burning fury. But anger alone wouldn't solve this. He would need composure, evidence, and the willingness of employees to testify or at least stand beside him. The next day, Ethan resolved he would ramp up his efforts. He would seek out anyone else who had been wronged or threatened. No more half measures. Greg's downfall was coming. He arrived early again the next morning, phone fully charged, heart pounding with a sense of urgency. He exchanged a glance with Mia, who was setting up her cash register. She looked exhausted, her eyes ringed with dark circles. For a moment, Ethan wondered how many other employees felt this level of despair, day in and day out. He made a quick decision. It was time to start forging a quiet alliance. Step by step, he would win the employees' trust, letting them know that help was near. Still in disguise, he approached Mia under the pretense of wiping down nearby surfaces. He spoke just loud enough for her to hear, but not so loud that others could eavesdrop. "If you ever need to talk," he said gently, "I'm here to listen. No judgments." Mia's eyes flicked to his in surprise, but she didn't say much. Instead, she offered a thin smile that spoke volumes, hope mixed with weariness. Ethan gave a slight nod before moving on, determined not to draw suspicion. Today, he would gather more evidence, and if everything went according to plan, he would soon move on to the next phase, confronting Greg in a way that the entire store could witness. It was time for a tyrant's downfall. By afternoon, Ethan had not only captured more footage of Greg's bullying but also discreetly spoken with 3 additional employees who confirmed that Greg had withheld overtime pay, forced them to clock out yet continue working, and regularly threatened them with termination for minor infractions. In each conversation, Ethan played the role of a sympathetic ear, taking mental notes. The store's tension was palpable, and it felt like something might snap at any moment. The biggest challenge was ensuring Greg didn't notice Ethan's sudden interest in everyone's grievances. So far, Greg was too arrogant to suspect the unassuming janitor could be a threat, but that arrogance could vanish instantly if he discovered a phone camera pointed his way. With enough footage and employee testimonies, Ethan decided it was almost time to make his stand. He knew that once he pulled the trigger, there would be no going back. Greg would likely fight back, try to pin blame elsewhere, or even turn violent. But if Ethan wanted real change, he had to risk it all. With every new story of abuse, he felt his resolve strengthen. That evening, he sent a confidential message to the few trusted executives who were in on his plan, letting them know he had compiled substantial evidence. They responded with shock at the extent of Greg's cruelty, and gave Ethan the green light to proceed however he saw fit. The next morning would mark the beginning of the end for Greg's reign of terror. Before turning in for the night, Ethan reviewed the video clips on his phone. Hearing Greg's venomous words on replay stoked a fresh wave of anger. But it also reaffirmed his purpose. By exposing Greg in front of the very employees he had terrorized, Ethan hoped to restore a sense of justice and dignity that had long been missing. He fell asleep imagining the look on Greg's face when he realized the janitor he'd ignored and disrespected was actually the CEO, and that all his dirty secrets were about to be laid bare. He woke before dawn, adrenaline already surging through his veins. He drove to the store in near darkness, determined that this would be the day. No matter how the confrontation played out, he would not back down. His employees, people like Mia and Corey, deserved a workplace free from fear. and he'd be damned if he let Greg continue abusing them a second longer than necessary. The building looked almost peaceful in the soft morning light, but Ethan knew that peace was an illusion. Inside, a storm was brewing, and he was about to unleash it for the sake of what was right. He parked discreetly, donned his janitor's uniform one last time, and entered through the side door. The stage was set. The tyrant's time was up. When the store opened, Greg strolled in as usual, oblivious to the trap that was about to close in on him. The air felt charged, like the static tension before a thunderstorm. Ethan busied himself mopping near the staff break room, where he overheard Greg barking orders for the day. He felt his heart thumping hard against his ribcage, but he kept his expression neutral. Employees moved about, eyes down, preparing for another day of potential humiliation. Ethan found himself scanning the faces of those who knew the secret, those who had quietly confided in him over the past few days. He caught sight of Louise, who offered the slightest nod of encouragement. Mia looked anxious but determined, and Corey stood by the cash registers, trying to steady his hands. They all sensed something was different today. The entire staff seemed to be holding their breath. Mid-morning, Greg called a mandatory staff meeting, complaining that productivity had been slipping. Everyone filed into the small conference area near the rear of the store. Ethan slipped in last, making sure to stand off to the side, mop in hand. Greg launched into a tirade, going on about how lazy everyone was, how replaceable they were, and how this store was on the brink of disaster, because no one respected his rules. He singled out Mia for sloppy cashier work, Corey for ineptitude at refunds, and threatened to fire anyone who didn't shape up immediately. That was all Ethan needed to hear. He stepped forward, clearing his throat loudly, his stomach tied in knots. Greg snapped his head around, glaring at the interruption. "You got something to say, janitor?" he snarled. Ethan set the mop aside. His heart hammered, but he spoke with a clear, steady voice. "Actually, yes. I have a lot to say." At first, Greg looked genuinely confused. There was a flicker of disbelief on his face, quickly replaced by anger. "You don't speak at my meetings," he hissed. "You clean floors. Now shut up or get out." Several employees gasped. Most had never heard anyone stand up to Greg so directly. Their eyes flicked between Greg and Ethan, bracing for the inevitable explosion. But Ethan didn't budge. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his company ID badge, the one that read CEO. He held it up for everyone to see. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Greg stared at the badge, eyes bulging, face blanching. Mia clapped a hand over her mouth in shock. Corey's jaw dropped. Louise wore a slow, satisfied grin. A hush fell over the room so thick it seemed to swallow all sound. For a long moment, Greg couldn't speak. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "I'm Ethan Carter," Ethan said, his voice resonating through the stunned silence. "I own this store. And I've been here undercover, watching how you treat my employees." Greg took a shaky step back, but Ethan advanced, pulling out his phone. "I have recordings of you berating, threatening, and humiliating staff. I also have testimonies from multiple employees about unpaid wages, forced overtime off the clock, and a dozen other labor violations." Greg's lips moved, but no sound emerged. The employees watched with a mixture of disbelief, awe, and a simmering anger that was finally finding a focus. Ethan turned to them, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "I started this company to provide good jobs and a supportive environment. The behavior I've seen here is unacceptable, and it stops today." The moment felt electric, years of pent-up frustration radiating from the employees in waves. Greg seemed to crumble before their eyes, his facade of power cracking irreparably. He tried to open his mouth again, perhaps to deny or deflect, but Ethan wasn't finished. "Greg, you're done. Effective immediately." In that instant, it was as if a dam broke. Employees exhaled collective relief. Some looked on the verge of tears, others just stared in amazement. Greg, for his part, tried one final act of desperation. You can't do this!" I have connections. You'll regret this, he sputtered, voice trembling. But it was too late. His intimidation held no power here anymore. Ethan turned to a security guard who, until now, had hung back uncertain. Escort him out, Ethan said calmly. The guard nodded. Greg tried to shake the guard off, but the guard stood firm. The employees parted like the Red Sea as the guard led Greg toward the exit, the once feared supervisor reduced to sputtering indignities that no one listened to. As he passed by, Ethan locked eyes with him. No one is above treating others with respect, Ethan said softly. No one. The store felt almost surreal in the aftermath. Greg was gone, yet the energy in the room lingered, like the echo of thunder after a storm. For a long, suspended moment, no one knew quite what to do. Then, tentatively, a ripple of applause began. It started with Luis, who clapped loudly, tears brimming in his eyes, soon joined by Mia, Corey, and others. The applause swelled into a roar, employees cheering not just for the unmasking of Greg but for the freedom they had yearned for all this time. Ethan raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd, though he couldn't hide a smile that tugged at his lips. Even as the CEO, he was unaccustomed to such direct, emotional gratitude from staff. Thank you, he said, voice slightly unsteady with emotion. I wish I had known sooner what was going on here. From now on, my door is always open. If anyone ever experiences anything like this again, you come directly to me or to HR. He could see the skepticism in some eyes, people who had endured too much to believe in instant change. So he continued, I understand trust has to be earned, especially after what you've been through. But I give you my word, we're going to address every unpaid wage, every stolen hour of overtime. We're going to make it right. Tears rolled down Mia's cheeks. She looked as if a crushing weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Corey stood by her, relief flooding his features. An undercurrent of hushed conversation buzzed through the employees. They were processing what had just happened, grappling with the sudden, monumental shift in their work lives. Louise stepped forward, hesitated, then reached out to shake Ethan's hand. Thank you, he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. We've needed this for a long time. Ethan nodded, clamping his other hand over Louise's in a gesture of solidarity. I'm sorry you had to wait, he replied, meaning every word. Ethan took a moment to look around the room, meeting the eyes of as many employees as he could. I can't fix everything overnight, he admitted, but I want you all to know that I see you, I value you, and I want this place to be somewhere you feel safe and respected. A wave of murmured agreement followed. Slowly, employees began to break away, returning to their stations with a new sense of hope. Mia lingered, working up the courage to approach. When she finally did, she spoke softly. I was so scared. I almost quit last week, but I needed the money. Now, Ethan finished her thought. Now you don't have to choose between your paycheck and your dignity. He paused, then added, if you still need time off for your classes, let me or the new manager know. We'll work out a schedule that fits your life. She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her tear-streaked face. Thank you, she whispered. I don't even know what to say. Ethan reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently. Just keep being the best cashier you can be. That's all I ever ask. The rest of the morning was spent in a flurry of activity, but the atmosphere had entirely changed. Employees walked with lighter steps. They spoke to each other more freely, exchanging cautious smiles that grew bolder as the hours passed. Customers, too, sensed the difference. Even though the public confrontation with Greg had happened privately among staff, the new sense of calm and assurance spread throughout the store like a warm current. Ethan, still dressed in his janitor uniform, wandered around, taking it all in. He'd have to switch back to his usual attire soon, now that his cover was blown. But for this moment, it felt right to remain alongside the staff, experiencing the day as they did. In the break room later, a few employees gathered around Ethan, openly asking questions about the future. Some worried about lingering retaliation, like if Greg had allies in higher positions. Others worried they might still be blamed for speaking out. Ethan addressed their concerns directly. No one here is going to face negative consequences for telling the truth. Greg operated through fear and lies, and that ends now. If anyone tries to punish you for speaking out, they'll have me to answer to. He made it clear there would be a new manager appointed soon, someone he trusted to prioritize fair treatment. He also promised to revisit each employee's work history to correct any wage discrepancies and to implement better policies for reporting abuse. It was a lot to take in, but for the first time in a long time, the staff seemed willing to believe that positive change was possible. By the late afternoon, some employees had already approached HR with testimonies about Greg's behavior. Ethan encouraged them, commending their courage. More than a few apologized for not speaking up sooner, but Ethan assured them it wasn't their fault. Toxic environments make you feel trapped, he told them. What matters is that we're fixing it now. He urged them to keep supporting each other, and not to hesitate if they saw any similar conduct in the future. Mia, Corey, and Luis were especially vocal, sharing details of withheld pay, forced extra hours, and verbal abuse. HR took detailed notes, promising to expedite the investigations. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that was only possible because employees finally felt safe enough to talk. That evening, as the store closed, Ethan gathered everyone in a final huddle before they clocked out. Today was a big step, he said, looking around at faces that, while still a bit uncertain, bore the relief of people who had just escaped a nightmare. Greg is out. We'll be bringing in a temporary manager while we finalize a permanent replacement. Your pay issues and scheduling conflicts are going to be resolved. But most importantly, I want you to remember that this place isn't just a job, it's a community. You all deserve respect and fairness. Never let anyone take that from you again. There was a round of quiet but heartfelt applause. People thanked Ethan personally, some with tears in their eyes, others with a simple handshake or a nod of gratitude. The store had never felt so united. As the employees drifted out, Ethan found himself alone by the entrance. He took a moment to reflect, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. His undercover mission was over, but the real work had just begun. Making sure the company lived up to its ideals would be an ongoing process, one he intended to oversee meticulously. And while Greg's downfall had been swift, it had also been necessary. The days of management by fear were done. Tomorrow, Ethan would come in dressed as himself, no more mop, no more disguise. He would stand before the staff as their CEO, transparent and committed to fostering an environment where no one would ever have to endure a tyrant like Greg again. The next morning, Ethan arrived in his usual business attire. Word had traveled fast that the CEO had been undercover, and employees greeted him with curiosity and respect. Some were still in awe, and a few shyly asked him questions about why he had chosen to go undercover rather than address the issues directly once he first heard about them. Ethan explained that he wanted to see firsthand how the store was run without the filter of official reports or corporate spin. The employees seemed to appreciate his dedication to finding the truth, though they were surprised he'd gone to such lengths. The new, temporary manager, a seasoned professional named Ava, known for her fair leadership style, had already arrived. She spent the morning meeting the team, listening to their concerns, and promising an open-door policy. It was a stark contrast to Greg's era of terror. The staff looked visibly relieved, cautiously optimistic that this was the beginning of a more respectful and cooperative workplace. Ethan spent most of his day attending to administrative tasks that had piled up during his undercover stint, but he paused frequently to walk the floor, checking in on employees. He stopped by Corey's register, asking how he was holding up. Corey smiled sheepishly. I still can't believe you're the CEO, he admitted, but I feel a lot better knowing that someone up there actually cares. Ethan reassured him that no matter one's title, everyone in the company was part of a team. He then found Mia, who looked less burdened than before. She said her shifts were now adjusted so she could attend evening classes without fear of losing her job or pay. She even planned to study during her breaks, something Greg would never have allowed. Ethan nodded, genuinely pleased. He also chatted briefly with Luis, who seemed buoyant, cracking jokes he never dared voice in the old regime. They stood near the entrance, reminiscing about the dramatic unveiling of Ethan's identity. Louise teased him, saying, "I had my suspicions, you know. No regular janitor stands that straight and confident." Ethan laughed, grateful for the lightness in the air. But as the day wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Greg wouldn't go down without a fight. True, Greg had been publicly dismissed and escorted out, but bullies sometimes lash out in unpredictable ways once their power is taken away. The possibility of a lawsuit, a smear campaign, or sabotage lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. He mentioned this concern to Ava, who promised extra vigilance, especially regarding store security and record keeping. "We'll make sure everything is by the book," she said with calm assurance. Ethan nodded, appreciating her level-headed approach. She'd already earned the staff's trust by listening to them and setting respectful boundaries, something Greg had never bothered to do. Throughout the week, more employees came forward with stories of harassment or wage inconsistencies, sharing them with Ava or HR. Some admitted that they used to think reporting these issues was pointless because Greg had the final say and clearly enjoyed wielding his power. Now they felt emboldened, like justice was finally within reach. Ethan ensured that every case was investigated thoroughly. He stayed up late some nights, reading through statements and investigating timecard discrepancies, and the more he discovered, the more he realized how deeply Greg's toxic leadership had corroded the store's morale. But with each new piece of evidence, the stronger the company's resolve became to rectify the damage. At the end of that week, Ethan held a store-wide meeting in the main aisle so customers could also see a slice of the company's new direction. Employees stood in a semicircle as he spoke clearly and calmly. "What happened here was unacceptable," he began, voice steady. "I never want anyone to experience that again. We're implementing new checks and balances to ensure supervisors treat their teams with respect. We're also revising our payroll systems so that no one is shorted a single penny." A faint cheer rose from some employees, and a few customers even applauded. Ethan continued, "We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. My promise to you is that we will keep learning, keep improving. Your voices matter. If we overlook something, tell us. If something needs fixing, we'll fix it." The unity in the room felt tangible, a shared sense of purpose emanating from those who had once been stifled by fear. Louise gave Ethan a thumbs up from across the crowd. Mia smiled through what looked like happy tears. And Corey, standing near a customer service desk, actually seemed proud to be working there. Over the next few days, the store seemed to settle into a new normal, one defined by open communication and mutual respect. Without Greg's constant supervision, employees found themselves able to focus on their tasks without the dread of being humiliated. Productivity, ironically enough, began to rise. Customers commented on how the staff seemed more cheerful and eager to help. Ethan felt a deep sense of validation, as though he had reaffirmed the soul of the company he'd built. He even took a moment to reflect privately, understanding that while Greg's downfall had been necessary, it also served as a lesson. He realized how crucial it was for upper management to remain vigilant, to maintain genuine contact with employees, and not to rely solely on second-hand reports or corporate filters. The cost of ignorance was too high. Near the end of the second week, Ethan decided to invite a few employees, including Mia, Corey, and Louise, to a small gathering in the break room. Ava was there as well, along with some representatives from HR. Over coffee and pastries, they discussed how to keep improving working conditions. Mia suggested a structured mentorship program for new hires, so they wouldn't feel as alone or vulnerable. Corey proposed updated training materials that emphasized respect and teamwork. Louise recommended regular team-building exercises to break down barriers. Ethan agreed to all these initiatives, seeing the potential to foster an environment where employees felt safe and valued. It was a simple meeting, but it symbolized a profound shift. Here they were, CEO and employees, sitting around the same small table, exchanging ideas as equals. The ghosts of Greg's reign seemed far away now, replaced by a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, things could stay this good. Time passed quickly, and the story of Ethan Carter's undercover mission spread throughout the entire company. Other branches heard rumors about how the CEO personally took down a tyrannical supervisor. Surprisingly, it boosted morale in places Ethan had never set foot in. Employees at different branches began emailing or calling to share that it gave them hope that they, too, would be heard if they ever had serious complaints. In a way, Greg's downfall became a catalyst for broader corporate introspection. Ethan directed HR to conduct a series of confidential employee surveys across all stores to ensure there were no other Gregs lurking in management. While the vast majority seemed fine, a few red flags popped up here and there, and those branches received immediate attention and corrective action. It felt like the entire company was undergoing a healing process, one sparked by a single supervisor's arrogance and cruelty. Meanwhile, back at the original store, life had settled into a new routine. Customers noticed how the staff seemed genuinely happier. Sales improved. Employee turnover decreased sharply. Ava, the temporary manager, had been asked to stay on permanently due to her outstanding performance. She accepted, thrilled at the opportunity to lead with integrity. Mia was thriving, juggling her studies and her cashier job without fear of punishment for adjusting her hours. Corey had regained confidence, no longer fumbling nervously at the register. Luis found renewed vigor in his work, telling younger employees funny stories that lightened the mood on tough days. The transformation was remarkable, and it all came down to a simple principle: treat people with respect, and they'll return the favor in their work. One afternoon, Ethan returned for a routine check-in, though this time there was no need for disguises. He walked through the aisles, greeting employees by name, smiling at the laughter and conversation that now filled the air. Eventually, he reached the spot near the manager's office where he had once overheard Greg's vicious words. The memory lingered, a grim reminder of how far they had come. Ava emerged from the office with a file in hand, smiling warmly. "Everything's running smoothly," she reported. "Payroll is on track, and the team's morale is high." Ethan nodded, taking a moment to appreciate the normalcy that had returned. "Thank you for all your work here," he told her sincerely. "You've turned this place around." He felt a gentle tug at his sleeve and turned to see Mia standing there, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Sir Ethan," she corrected herself, still getting used to being on a first-name basis. "I just wanted to say thank you. I'm actually enjoying coming to work now, and I never thought that would be possible." Ethan smiled, patting her on the shoulder. "I'm happy you stuck around." Corey joined them, nodding in agreement. "We owe a lot to you," he said. "I can finally do my job without worrying about being screamed at." Ethan laughed softly. "You owe it to yourselves, too? Standing up to a bully isn't easy. I'm proud of you." Later, Ethan watched from the sidelines as employees helped each other with restocking, answered customer questions with genuine enthusiasm, and occasionally shared jokes that sent them into fits of laughter. The difference was night and day compared to the oppressive silence when Greg ruled. Standing there, Ethan felt a wave of contentment. He'd taken a risk going undercover, but seeing the vibrant energy among these hardworking people made it all worthwhile. This was what he had envisioned when he first founded the company, a place where people could earn a living with dignity and camaraderie. The store now reflected that vision more than ever. It was a triumph, not just for Ethan but for every employee who had weathered Greg's storm and come out on the other side, stronger and freer. The final closure came a few weeks later, when legal proceedings confirmed Greg's termination due to documented abuse and financial misconduct. The company cooperated fully with authorities, ensuring Greg would have no grounds for wrongful termination claims. In the end, he faced legal repercussions for his actions, and employees finally had closure, knowing their tormentor was held accountable. The chapter had come to a satisfying close for everyone except Greg. In the store, a sort of celebratory mood took hold. While there was no official party, employees brought in homemade treats, passed around thank you cards, and shared relief that the toxic era was finally behind them. Some even joked about what it would be like if Ethan ever decided to go undercover again. Would they be able to spot him next time? Ethan visited the store on a quieter afternoon, greeted by the cheerful bustle of employees and customers. He shook hands, exchanged warm smiles, and answered questions from curious patrons who had heard the rumors but never witnessed the drama themselves. Eventually, he found a moment of peace in the very same break room where, weeks prior, employees had gathered in fear, waiting to be reprimanded by Greg. Now, the break room felt light and welcoming. Pictures of staff outings were taped to the walls, along with a large Employee of the Month board that featured multiple winners, Ava's idea to recognize teamwork rather than single out one individual. Standing in that room, Ethan reflected on how swiftly a culture could change when a single malignant root was removed. He felt an immense sense of responsibility to maintain this healthier environment, ensuring no one else could exploit their position like Greg had. Before leaving, Ethan took one last walk around the aisles. He said his farewells to each employee, shaking hands and giving words of encouragement. When he passed by Luis, the older man clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You did good, kid. I can actually enjoy my last few working years now." It touched Ethan deeply, reminding him that the decisions made at the top had real, tangible consequences for people's everyday lives. He promised himself he would never forget that. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow on the storefront. As Ethan headed to his car, he paused to look back, feeling a swell of pride and relief. He had exposed a greedy supervisor and set things right, but it wasn't just about punishing Greg. It was about reminding everyone, including himself, what the company stood for. Integrity, respect, and unity had triumphed over fear. That victory was worth more than any profit margin. He drove away knowing he'd return often, not because he had to spy or go undercover, but because he wanted to stay connected. This store would stand as a testament to what he believed in and what he was willing to fight for. The memory of Greg's downfall would linger, yes, but it would serve as a cautionary tale for anyone else who might misuse their power. In the end, it was a story of redemption, for the employees who found their voice, for the company that reaffirmed its values, and for Ethan himself, who realized that sometimes, to protect what you love, you have to step into the fray personally. After everything, he wouldn't have had it any other way.